Hey everybody, this is Mr. Clapp here talking about photosynthesis, probably the most important process that happens in living things, although there's one that rivals it, which we'll talk about next week, which is cellular respiration. So photosynthesis is one of the ways organisms get the energy and parts they need to build their body. Once upon a time, a long time ago, there was a good scientist named Alan Turing, and Alan Turing came up with this definition of life. He said anything that can use the resources of the world to get copies of itself made is alive. This is a really weird definition of life. We're used to hearing things like organized structure and made of cells and all of these kind of things. His definition is pretty broad, but it does have some value to it. So you can imagine living things being anything that can do this, can accumulate resources of the world and make another copy of themselves. Turing was a famous proponent of AI and one of the first people to develop computers. And so he talked a lot about artificial intelligence and the potential for a non-biological life form. So let's start there. Let's imagine that. Like if you imagine some kind of a robot that was capable of making copies of itself, what would it need in order to do that? If a Wally here wasn't in charge of cleaning up trash, but was in charge of making new Wallies, how would it go about it? So my argument, and perhaps Turing's as well, would be you need three things to make copies of yourself. To begin with, you need parts, right? If you're a robot, you need the parts to make a robot. So it'd be nice if you were Wally and lived in a junkyard, because then you'd have access to all the parts to build yourself. You'd also need the energy to go around and get those parts. So maybe in the case of Wally, you use solar energy. Maybe you get your energy from a battery, whatever it is, but you need some source of energy. And then finally, you need some kind of a plan knowing how to put the parts together. So somewhere inside you, you need a plan to know how do you organize the parts to make a new version of yourself. This might work for a robot. This kind of robot doesn't exist yet, but maybe it will someday. And for now, this only happens in biological systems. But we can think of it in the same way. Biological systems need energy, parts, and a plan. We get our energy, depending on the type of living thing we are, either from the stuff that we eat or literally from the sun. Autotrophs, what we've been referring to as producers, get their energy from the sun. Heterotrophs, consumers, get their energy from the things they eat. Pretty simple. If you're a plant, you get your juice from the sun. If you're an animal, you get your juice from the plants or animals that you eat. So you need the energy to move around. So plants, like Wally, have the solar panels. Everybody else steals their energy from somebody else. As far as parts go, well, we heterotrophs that eat other things get the parts we need from other things we eat too. So when we eat something, we get the parts from them and the energy from the bonds between those parts. Autotrophs, on the other hand, believe it or not, get the parts they need from the air and water and to some degree nutrients in the soil. So the atoms you need to make a plant are all available in the air and in the water, with a few exceptions in the soil. Animals and other heterotrophs get the parts they need from the food they eat. They get the energy from them, and they also get the parts from them. And finally, as far as the plan goes, well, all living things have a plan. Our plans are written in DNA, which are molecules inside every cell of our bodies. It doesn't have to be this way. If you're a Wally, it might be written in digital code, but there has to be some kind of a plan. And in the case of all living things, it's written in the language of DNA, which is a topic for another day. So today's focus is how autotrophs get the energy and parts they need from light and from the resources in the environment. Autotrophs or producers do this from a process called photosynthesis. So they get their energy from the sun and most of their parts from the air and the water through this process. Believe it or not, yes, plants build themselves out of air and water using the energy from sunlight to do it. It's like they're walking around, they're a Wally walking around a junkyard, picking up all the parts they need from air and water and the energy they need from the sun. In this process, plants and animals, or autotrophs and heterotrophs in a larger sense, definitely conserve energy. No energy is created in the process of building a living thing. Energies get converted from one type of energy into another. Now the sun has energy, and that type of energy can be converted into stored energy in the bodies of living things. It's not destroyed, it's not made, it's just converted. So for example, the sun shines its rays down on us, and this is what we call electromagnetic waves. The plant turns these electromagnetic waves into the bonds between atoms, which is what we refer to as chemical energy. Again, the simple process, think of these little stars as the energy. The sun converts the energy of sunlight into the energy of the bonds between atoms. And this particular molecule here is called glucose. It's the main sugar that's made by plants as they go through this process of photosynthesis. Glucose is made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but the energy is in the bonds between them. So see, that's where the stars show up in this model. In this process of photosynthesis, matter is also conserved. You can't make carbon atoms from nothing. You can't make oxygen or hydrogen atoms from nothing. You get them from somewhere and you repurpose them. Just like Wall-E wouldn't make any parts, he's just taken parts from the junkyard and recombining them to make a new robot. When we make living things, we recombine parts too. And parts are never destroyed in these normal chemical processes. For this example here, when you burn a log, you start with 31 kilograms of matter. In the end, you have 31 kilograms of matter. No carbon atoms, no hydrogen atoms, nobody went anywhere. In this somewhat crude example, again, if Pac-Man eats some carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, they don't go away. Maybe some go to build his body, maybe some gets put out as waste, but none of these atoms disappear. So when we do photosynthesis, we have to conserve energy and we have to conserve parts. We just rearrange parts and rearrange energy. So, photosynthesis is literally, and I've said this a couple of times, the conversion of air and water into sugar. It's a crazy idea, but this is exactly what happens. Air and water rearrange those parts, we add some sunlight energy, and we make sugar. And yeah, we give off a waste product of oxygen, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, in order to explain this in more detail, we need to understand how to model chemistry. There are lots of different ways we can model atoms and molecules. We can get really complex, like some of the first ones we talked about a few days ago, where we model every electron and proton and neutron in an atom. This here is, of course, H2O or water. But sometimes we don't want to waste our time writing the nucleus of atoms or even the electrons. We just know the properties of how many bonds they make, and we just go from there. So we can get simpler with this kind of a model here, where we represent oxygen with its two little sticks representing its shared electrons with hydrogen. And we can get even simpler if we don't want to write the little circles and get fancy, where we just write the lines and the letters. And these are all working models that get more simple depending on what you're trying to do. And of course, we can also write our models in this very traditional format, showing we have two hydrogens here, H with a little subscript 2, and then for every oxygen. All of these are valid. It just depends on how you want to model it. So we'll be using mostly the last two of these as we talk about photosynthesis. We'll talk about the chemical formula using the letters just on the far right here, and we'll also talk about how we might model stuff if we were using the less simple version where we have the bonds between atoms, so we can talk about how they rearrange. So the end product of photosynthesis is glucose, or sugar. And this type of sugar we can model a couple of different ways, because we're going to talk about it going forward. One way we can model it, just the chemical formula, looks like this. C6H12O6. 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens found in glucose. If we want a little more detail, we can model it with the little lines in structure. Again, we're not going to go all the way down to protons, neutrons, and electrons, but we can model it this way too. So glucose's main structure is actually a ring of carbon, but one of the corners is replaced with an oxygen. So we essentially have this ring. All sugars are made of rings much like this, where we have mostly carbon rings with a little bit on the edges. Now, if you know anything about the way atoms bond, you know that oxygen makes 2 bonds. So this oxygen in our corner is happy just the way it is. So we start out with this carbon ring with the oxygen in the corner, and we actually add one more carbon off the edge of this one carbon. Now, if you know anything about the way atoms bond, you know that oxygen only makes 2 bonds. So this oxygen in our corner is happy just the way it is. But all of the carbon atoms make 4 bonds, so they need to have more things attached to them. The one next to the oxygen has 3, so it's doing pretty well, but everybody else needs more. So let's add these extra bonds. So if we add extra bonds onto these carbons, we can add bonds and add another layer of oxygen. Again, we still haven't finished all the bonds of carbon, And all of these outer oxygens also only have one bond to them. So we need to add another layer of bonds. These bonds from each will fill up the number of bonds that carbon and oxygen make. And what do we add? Well, on the edges, we add hydrogens. So every one of these also builds a hydrogen. This is glucose. This is the sugar that's made by plants. This is the sugar that's made by all autotrophs. And it's super, super important to the life of living things because sunlight energy is stored in the bonds between these atoms. On the previous picture a couple ones ago, we just showed you that carbon circle, but here it is in that full detail. The energy is stored in the bonds between these atoms. When we as living things need it, break these bonds, break down the sugar, and we get that energy. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So when we talk about chemical processes, how we move from one set of molecules to another, it's an awful lot like a mathematical equation. But there are some differences. In math equations, you have things on one side of an equal sign that are the same as the other. For example, 4 plus 3 equals 7. In math, you can flip this around. So you can say 7 equals 4 plus 3. That still works. We could say 3 and 3 plus 4 equals 7. We can move around those plus signs too. Most of this is true for chemical reactions, but chemical reactions have a direction to them. They have a direction. In other words, the things on the left have to be on the left, and we call those reactants. Things on the right have to be on the right, and we call those products. So for example, we might take hydrogen gas and oxygen gas, combine them, and make water. This is a chemical reaction. We have stuff on the left that converts into stuff on the right, reactants that convert into products. Now, if we're being honest here and take a look and pay attention, we notice that we did something wrong here. On our reactant side, we have 2 hydrogen atoms bonded together to make a hydrogen gas. And we have 2 oxygen atoms bonded together to make oxygen gas. But on the right, we have 2 hydrogens. That makes sense. But we only have 1 oxygen. In other words, it looks like we lost an oxygen. And we can't do that. We can't destroy or make any matter. We can't lose an atom in a chemical reaction, and we can't gain any. So in reality, we have to do what's called balancing this equation, which means it takes twice as much hydrogen gas to make water. Now here, we take 2 hydrogen gas atoms. Here we take 2 hydrogen gas molecules, so in other words, 4 total hydrogens, and we convert it into water. But now you'll notice on the right, we're missing hydrogens. So we have to make this 2 waters. So now all the numbers work out. We have 4 hydrogens on the left and 2 oxygens. And on the right, we also have 4 hydrogens and 2 oxygens just recombined. This is a very typical chemical reaction. Balanced, so we have the same number of elements on both sides and moving in one direction. Here's another example of a chemical reaction, again, showing that balanced process. This is propane burning. Propane is that C3H8. When you burn propane, you combine it with oxygen in the air, and you give off water and carbon dioxide plus that heat energy. The bonds of propane are broken, giving off heat energy. So we're converting chemical energy into heat energy. But importantly for this topic, it takes a lot of oxygen gas to burn 1 molecule of propane. And yes, believe it or not, we give off carbon dioxide into the air, but also water. When you burn propane, you're actually putting water in the air too. If you count up everything, we have the same number of things on the left and the right. And that's important in any chemical reaction. Okay, so what is it? What's the chemical reaction that gives us photosynthesis? So here it is. Here's the equation of photosynthesis. This is one of the most important equations, and you should certainly know it. In photosynthesis, we take the energy from light plus carbon dioxide and water, combine them to make sugar or glucose, and give off a waste product of oxygen. This is what every autotroph does every day as it goes through the process of photosynthesis, converting light energy into sugar. Now, again, if we're being honest, the way this equation is written, it's not balanced. Right now, we only have 1 carbon on the left, we have 6 on the right. Only 2 hydrogen on the left, but 12 on the right. Only 3 oxygen on the left, but we have 8 on the right. So we have to balance it. And here it is with the right coefficients. We still have that light energy, but it takes 6 CO2s and 6 H2Os to make 1 glucose, and they give off 6 oxygen. This is photosynthesis written out. You're expected to know this and expected to understand it. How we convert from carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen. Many different organisms do photosynthesis. They're all called autotrophs or producers. The misconception nearly everyone has is everybody thinks that all autotrophs are plants. They're not. Plants are one group of autotrophs that have roots, typically have bark, what we call vascular system, for moving stuff up and down their bodies. But that's just plants. They're mostly found on land, and yeah, in some aquatic systems on land. But the ocean, where most of the photosynthesis of the world happens, is made up of mostly algae. Algae can be single-celled organisms, little tiny things like what we call cyanobacteria, and it can also be bigger things like kelp and seaweed. But they're not plants. They don't have the same structures. That's for another class, but the point is not only plants make photosynthesis. Other things do it too. Algae, weird things called euglena that can actually do photosynthesis and get their own and eat other things as well as move. And then yeah, bacteria that are in the ocean that do this stuff too. So plants do photosynthesis, but they're not the only ones. They're not even the most abundant ones. These single-celled bacteria and protists make up more. In these cells of these plants and these other autotrophs like algae, they all have these organelles called chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are where photosynthesis happens. Inside chloroplasts, there's this really important stuff called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is this green coloring that makes all autotrophs green, and it's where photosynthesis happens. It's where they combine the CO2 and H2O to make sugar. There are more steps to this process that you'll learn in another biology class later on, hopefully, but for our purposes, that's what happens. Carbon dioxide and water make sugar and oxygen. Okay, so realize, though, that plants don't get everything they need from air and water. If you're a plant, sure, you get all the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen you need to make sugar from the air and water. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are taken care of. But the other three things you need to build proteins and your DNA and other parts of your body, you need to suck up from the nutrients in the soil, or you get it from the nutrients in the water in which you grow. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur are all super important too, but plants don't get those from the air and water. They get those from the soil. You can use the energy from the sun and the parts you get from air and water to build your bodies. Yep, you need a little bit of extra, but that's pretty much it. Hopefully that does it for you. Thanks.